All right. I am Allie Miller, go by Allie Miller RD, and today I am going to be talking about why food matters and how to figure out in all of the noise of what can sometimes be polarizing variances within the ketogenic space, selecting what foods work best for you and your body and ways to consider feedback from your body and be able to interpret that feedback, because what works for you in one season may dynamically shift based on stress levels, based on activity factor, based on climate, and so much more. So I'm excited for this conversation today. Before we go into that, I'll just share a little bit with you guys about my background. So I am a registered dietitian, hence the RD part of my branding. And what's unique about my background is that I went to a naturopathic college of medicine, Bastyr University. So I have an integrative approach, and I use functional medicine with food as medicine interventions. I have been clinically using a ketogenic diet since 2009, and I have a podcast called Naturally Nourished. I have a virtual clinic. I live in Austin, Texas, and have a virtual clinic and work with people in various countries throughout the world. And I have a supplement line called Naturally Nourished as well. And I'm the author of 3 books: Naturally Nourished, which came out in 2015, that is Food as Medicine for Optimal Health; The Anti-Anxiety Diet, which came out in 2018. And then last fall, I came out with its complementary book, The Anti-Anxiety Diet Cookbook. So for those of you that aren't familiar with this term, functional medicine, I always like to kind of set the stage with describing how I approach individuals differently than maybe some mainstream dietitians or doctors in the scope. And the way that I approach every patient is as a detective of their body. I'm always asking questions about how they got to the space that they're currently in and trying to determine what would be underlying mechanisms throwing their body into a state of imbalance. So a really great visual is this iceberg, as I'm always looking to seek the root causes or the underlying causes of an undesired symptom or disease state. And as you'll see above the surface, we see things like cancer, diabetes, fibromyalgia, arthritis, depression, anxiety, obesity, and underlying mechanisms would be much more complex. As we know, for those of us that are looking for weight loss, it's not as simple as a calculator, 1 + 2 = 3, or calories in, calories out. There are such complex mechanisms that influence our biochemistry. And that's where today's conversation of what foods fit best for you will take that to the next level. So we're looking at underlying mechanisms of elements of inflammation. We're looking at your microbiome or how your gut bacteria play a role in your whole body health. I'm examining hormonal imbalance in the body, the process of detoxification, how the liver and kidneys are functioning, how your body is endogenously or internally producing antioxidants. I'm looking at micronutrient deficiencies and malabsorption patterns or digestive distress in the system. And that's just some of the things that I look underlying in the waters. So if we're looking at the application of a ketogenic diet and how this has a functional approach on the body, I wanted to break down some of the mechanisms of action, if you will, or how the production of ketones impacts varied elements of your body. So when we're looking at body composition change, we see the impact on HGH, our human growth hormone, and that's one of the mechanisms of how the ketogenic diet is muscle sparing. We also see that we are liberating fat via the production of ketones, especially when calorie restricted and not overfeeding ourselves with fat. And that's creating that dynamic shift in body composition of liberating percentage of body fat or loss of body fat while maintaining that muscle mass, which is super important, because if we were just calorie restricting, we would lose more from our muscle mass, and that's going to over time reduce our basal metabolic rate, which means that weight gain will likely be more seen with calorie restriction over a ketogenic diet because of that composition change that we see from the successful application. We also see the double benefit of satiety enhancements with ketogenic diet. We see an influence on leptin. And I'll talk about that a little bit today. In my cookbook, the Anti-Anxiety Diet Cookbook, I dedicated an entire section on leptin. This is one of my favorite hormones to nerd out about. In the Greek language, the word translates to thin, and we've thought of this hormone as a satiety hormone. So ghrelin is a hunger-related hormone, and leptin is a satiation-related hormone. We see that individuals that have leptin resistance tend to be those that also have insulin resistance. So when you reduce your carbohydrates in your diet, you bring down that high level of insulin, reducing your insulin resistance, enhancing your insulin sensitivity. And during that same process of enhanced insulin metabolism or reduced excess insulin, we also see that leptin level starts to become more favorably metabolized and docks with our brain receptor, giving our body that satiety, which helps us to maintain compliance or consistency within our diet protocol so that we're not white knuckling our hanger, our hungry and angry response of the blood sugar roller coaster dips and spikes. We also can see the ketogenic diet having many anti-inflammatory effects, especially if you're doing a whole foods approach. We'll talk today a little bit more about how you can take your ketogenic diet to be more anti-inflammatory. When we remove pro-inflammatory foods, we know that that's going to enhance the already anti-inflammatory mechanisms of ketones. We see in the brain that there's less ROS or reactive oxygen species and less inflammation in the body when we are using ketones as a fuel source. That same mechanism can impact cognitive enhancement. So we can see that we also, beyond the reactive oxidative species or less oxidative stress in the brain, we can also see an improvement in our brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which aids in neurogenesis. And this helps how our neurotransmitters function and our brain functions. We can see impacts of nutritional ketosis on mood stability and having anxiolytic or anxiety-reducing effects, because ketones actually enhance GABA expression in the brain. GABA is that primary inhibitory mellower outer compound in our brain that takes off that white knuckle effect of the stress response and can often have a lot of peripheral impact, especially in today's climate when things feel a little bit uncertain. A lot of people have expressed that kind of just buzz or feeling of anxiety stepping out to the grocery store or being outdoors. And ketones can actually help to mitigate that by upregulating our GABA expression. GABA can take those micro tremors, the dryness in the mouth, the proverbial elephant on the chest, and reduce that functioning as an inhibitory compound. We also see that when ketones cross the blood-brain barrier, they can reduce epinephrine, that primary adrenaline fight or flight chemical, in an excess level. And on the hormone world of things, we see that ketones can play a fantastic role as a tool for managing PCOS. I see so many miracle keto babies in my clinic, and I know that the FSH and LH, follicular stimulating and luteinizing hormone in the brain, are impacted by ketones. And we can see the use of elevated DHEA. Your body can metabolize DHEA, which is a stress hormone and often can drive infertility and androgenic expression in women. That when we make ketones, we can metabolize down that DHEA elevation. And we can see that we can liberate excessive estrogen through body fat loss, especially if we're supporting our diet with detoxifying nutrients. Now, with that said, all of that magic of ketosis is why we're all here, right? Why we're all listening to these presentations and why we're all committed to being fat burners. But it's important that we take some time to acknowledge that everything has a sweet spot and anything can be done in excess or be overburdening for the body as well. So I do want to call out some of the potential pitfalls of keto. And as I express and explain each of these, you'll see that often there's other contributing factors. I'm very clearly, for the record, will state that carbohydrates are a non-essential nutrient. We know that the body can go through gluconeogenesis from other energy substrates, and that the body doesn't lower or drop its glucose levels to dangerously low levels when producing ketones. In fact, they stay very normalized. So you'll always have the glucose needed to make your thyroid stimulating hormone or to support the brain. But when paired with stress, when paired with calorie restriction and excessive time restriction eating, some individuals will see that they would benefit from potentially looking at metabolic flexibility and expanding their carbohydrates, still producing ketones, but maybe in a less restrictive approach, or considering carb cycling. So when we look at the impact of keto, we have to acknowledge that it is a hormetic stressor. When the ketones do cross our blood-brain barrier, they engage with our HPA axis, which is that primary regulator of our fight or flight or rest and digest, sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system. Now, most people will get beneficial enhancement, as I mentioned, in brain chemistry and in inflammation and with sexual hormones, but there is that influence on a hormonal level that must be acknowledged. As I mentioned with leptin and satiety, most individuals starting a ketogenic diet are entering in a status of insulin resistance. And likely those same individuals have leptin resistance, which means as they go into nutritional ketosis, they'll start to also, as that insulin declines, get leptin sensitivity and enhanced satiety, which is fantastic. However, those individuals that are at a low percent body fat and are menstruating and have hypothyroid and are under high stress and under sleeping and over exercising, and that sounds like a lot of layers, but somehow I've fit into that category for years, taking the spin classes and overburdening themselves with exercise output, we can actually see in some individuals, especially again, those that are menstruating females that run at a low percent body fat, that they can actually get low levels of leptin. And if their leptin levels are not regulated, then that can send signals to their HPA axis that they aren't fed. Now, eating enough fat in the diet can be one way to not have to worry about opening into the world of carbohydrate exploration, or if you would need to consider a carb cycle. However, for many people, such as myself, often that benefit of satiety of keto and under a high stress time can sometimes lead to under eating fat, believe it or not, even within a ketogenic protocol. So some individuals do need to watch to ensure that they are eating enough calories to ensure that they don't get leptin dips, because that can interfere with loss of period or cycle, driving things like hypothalamic amenorrhea. Again, as you'll see, this is a big caution if we're under stress and we have calorie restriction. If you're able to consume enough calories, you can likely still do that without adjusting your macros significantly. We can see dips in DHEA, as I mentioned, individuals with PCOS that have high DHEA, keto is a fantastic way of metabolizing that down. But for maybe our postmenopausal women that have been at this for a while, and they may have had chronic stress in their past life, and they may be dealing with adrenal insufficiency, if they're not getting that keto high or that buzz and that energy, and they're feeling stretched out and fatigued, they may need to explore the status of their DHEA levels. So this is a big consideration that we look at, because this can decline over time. And then we have to be mindful that as we liberate fat, we are also liberating whatever that body fat was storing. So over time, we're going to have favorable metabolic expression and less inflammation, but we need to be mindful about the estrogen that is liberated from our adipocytes or our fat cells, the cortisol from our stress history that's liberated from our fat cells that was stored from that gnarly divorce 20 years ago, as well as the toxins that we've experienced in the 6 billion pounds that are released in our environment every year that are stored away in our fat to keep us safe. So once you start going into your fat reserves as fuel, you are liberating some of these compounds. And this is where I've seen in some individuals that have done dynamic fasting, as well as a tight carbohydrate restricted diet like a carnivore approach, where liver enzymes have gone up into the multiple hundreds when they've lost 40 pounds in a rapid 2-month window or 3-month window. because that liver gets overburdened with the estrogen. So we need to be mindful of how to modify and support that gland with targeted nutrients that would not bombard it while we're liberating from the fat stores. And we can also see fasting can have some faux pas. So fasting generally is going to ramp up that HGH, is going to support cognitive clarity, is going to support the immune system and the processes of autophagy, which I'm sure we'll hear eloquently expressed through various speakers in this forum. But we can also see with fasting, especially an individual that's running low body fat, that has a good amount of lean mass, and is under high stress and under sleeping, that their epinephrine or adrenaline levels can go up higher if the body is over fasted and perceives that food insecurity. So especially with high caffeine and exercise and stress, that's when we start to see some of these mechanisms go a little bit off kilter. So food matters. What you eat is extremely important. And so I'm all about, in fact, I was going to make a t-shirt for this conference, maybe I still will, that says real food greater than macros. And I know that we have to get off the blood sugar roller coaster and go beyond low glycemic and get back to these hybrid machines that have the access to ketones as a fuel source. But we have to, now that we've hopefully most of us mastered the ability to do so, be very mindful about what we are putting in our tank, because food is a double-edged sword. What you're putting in your body can either be contributing to inflammation, sterilizing your microbiome, driving hormone dominance and imbalance, or it could be doing the other oppositional effect. What you're eating could be reducing inflammation. It could be providing a robust microbiome and balancing out your sexual hormones and neurotransmitters. Your body requires nutrients for all of its biochemical reactions. And this is why I believe so strongly in food as medicine. Every single dysfunction in the body, there are particular nutrients that we can upregulate to enhance the body's function and support and resolve, as opposed to band-aid and symptom manage with medication intervention as a first line of defense. So our body requires vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and amino acids for its various functions of needs. And it's time we start considering what those are beyond just macros of proteins, fats, and carbs. So let's look at a pro-inflammatory versus anti-inflammatory approach first and unpack that a little bit further. If we're looking at pro-inflammatory foods, we want to make sure that we start to remove oxidized polyunsaturated fats. So we think to demonize our omega-6 fatty acids, and you'll hear in the next slide me talk about the benefit of omega-3 fatty acids, which are kind of the counterpart there. But we have to watch if we are eating fried foods. We much prefer fried foods cooked in tallow or traditional saturated fats, which would be safe. Just kind of unpacking, polyunsaturated fats means many bonds that are not closed, and that means many opportunities for oxidative damage and inflammation in the body. And so when we're looking at corn oil and soy oil, you might find products that fit your macros, but are still highly laden with these pro-inflammatory ingredients. We see dairy, which can be a big staple in an entry approach to the ketogenic diet because of casein. Casein, we know there's two forms, and the more Americanized approach to dairy production is higher in the A1 casein, which is more inflammatory. It distresses the gut lining, and it crosses the blood-brain barrier, which can drive our opioid receptor activity. So we can see irritability and addictive tendency when we're looking at things like bipolar disorder and mania or depression. Dairy can be a big pitfall there. And then I didn't even mention on my slide the fact that dairy itself is estrogenic. So if you're looking at liberating body fat loss, remember your body fat cells themselves are already estrogenic. So this may not be the appropriate time to also layer in more of an external source of estrogen and expect your body to cope well and be in a good state of balance. Lectins are another thing to consider. So this comes in the concept of Dr. Gundry's plant paradox and a lot of the approach of the carnivore approach. So for those of us that experience digestive distress or bloating or inflammatory conditions in our joints or even mood disorders, we see that a lot of plant-based foods, because they can't run away from us, have their own world of anti-nutrients. And we know that lectins are some of those that are the most harmful to the gut lining and drive leaky gut, which can mean that our gut lining damage allows larger particles to get into the bloodstream, and the immune system responds with buckets of inflammatory chemicals. The big ones that I see in the keto space could be tomatoes, peppers, zucchini. These are the higher lectin vegetables. We do see lectins in many grain foods, which I didn't list, but gluten, corn, but watch out for the byproducts of these foods. Maybe we're not eating them in abundance, but they could be byproducts like maltodextrin, or gluten can be used in many foods as an additive. And then in general, we can have our own immune system response to foods that drives inflammation. So if you've eliminated these three categories and you're doing a ketogenic diet, but you have an elevated C-reactive protein level, that's your marker of inflammation in the body, or if you're dealing with various forms of itises, whether it's gastritis or plantar fasciitis or arthritis, any of these inflammatory conditions, and you've already removed these foods and maybe you've layered on the 5 foods that I identify in the anti-anxiety diet, then you may need to consider doing some individualized deeper dive into some food sensitivity testing. I will say, for the record, I'm not a fan of IgG testing alone. There's a lot of at-home kits now that are providing that, but really there's a 40 to 70% false positive that we get with the ingredients that are tested with an IgG panel. So make sure, if you're looking at food sensitivity and inflammatory food testing, my favorite panel available is called the MRT test. It stands for Mediator Release Test. And make sure that you look at what the test is testing instead of just your data, because you might get some of those false positives. But based on this immunological variance, that means that any one superfood could be someone else's kryptonite. So it may shock you to hear that I've seen individuals that have had a significant inflammatory response to, God forbid, coconut or pork, which could be big staples of our daily diet and maybe why we're not getting resolution in our wellness. On the latter end of this double-edged sword, so we're removing our pro-inflammatory foods. Well, now we want to start to consider abundance of anti-inflammatory foods. So some of the fantastic sources that we have come back to how the animal product itself was raised. So if we're looking at proteins, grass-fed meats are going to have higher CLAs, or conjugated linoleic acids. We're going to get more omega-3 fatty acids in these cuts. Same with our wild fish, which are going to be eating plankton and other fish as their diet, as opposed to corn, which fish are fed in a farm-raised form. We're going to get a much better fatty acid profile. And it's important to note that when you're eating your animals, which I'm a big proponent of eating animal, making sure that you are applying a snout to tail philosophy, because that's going to balance out your amino acids to be less inflammatory. So we want things like glycine and glutamine, these particular amino acids. Glycine can play a role with releasing our tension that we hold in our jaw or our neck or our shoulders after stressful times. Glycine also aids in liberating body fat to aid with body fat burn. Glutamine, which we see in our bone broth, is a fantastic amino acid for repairing our gut lining. So now that we've removed those pro-inflammatory foods, having collagen, gelatin, and bone broth as a staple in the diet can help to seal the tank, if you will, of the gut. Berries are another area to consider. These are very low glycemic and in most individuals well tolerated, rich in anthocyanins, particular antioxidants in that purple pigment family, which have fantastic way of reducing oxidative stress in the body. Cultured vegetables have a double hit. Likely many of them are cruciferous in their orientation, which we'll talk about more when we get to hormones. And we'll talk more about cultured element when we talk about the microbiome. But you are getting the probiotic and the detox support from these foods. And then we want to consider an abundance of color. And this might start if you're at a tighter carbohydrate threshold, or you're keeping your carbs at a tighter number, you can still get these antioxidants from things like teas, which are high in polyphenols, herbs, seasonings, and spices like turmeric, ginger, you name it. So if you're considering carnivore, I use carnivore in my clinic, and I think it's a fantastic tool. And some people really thrive doing a zero carbohydrate diet. The nutrient density in a carnivore diet is fantastic. If you are doing a snout to tail approach to it, you're going to get fantastic support for gut. And if your gut was in a distressed state and you had a lot of breakdown, ulceration, and tissue damage, by giving your gut a rest from those plant lectins and other anti-nutrients, it does allow a more focused time for the gut to repair. So the biggest patient population that I would use carnivore for are individuals having autoimmune flare and those that have inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's, ulcerative colitis. Now, we want to be a little bit mindful if we are doing this low of a threshold of carbohydrate that we check in with our leptin values, especially if we see variance within our sexual hormones or if we're seeing variance within our sleep patterns, like waking in the middle of the night, feeling on eggshells, dealing with epinephrine or cortisol surges, because the low levels of leptin can throw off that HPA axis. And if you need to stay tight carnivore for other reasons or per desire, you might consider working around this by doing refeed days with higher calorie intake. That's often a way that we can work around this. The lack of diversity can be an influence on the microbiome, and we'll unpack that a little bit further. I have seen clinically that when we get, again, the high liberation of fat, so what's your starting point when you're going tight carnivore? The high liberation of fat, if you've lost dynamic amounts of body fat in a short window, can be distressing to the liver. And we do see often the need of therapeutic tools like N-acetylcysteine, glutathione, and looking at things like milk thistle seed and phosphatidylcholine, all as ways to support that liver to process the burden from the breakdown of fat that it's trying to metabolize, because there is typically a very dynamic weight loss if we're coming at it from a high body fat. And then for some people, this diversity may also hinder endogenous antioxidant production, or how the body produces antioxidants. And it's interesting because that's the argument that many people will give against consumption of vegetation. So Dr. Paul Saladino and I have had this conversation, and Mike Mutzel and I, in a sense that, I'm not sure how Paul and I sit on it, but I know Mike and I sit on it in a similar stance, in the sense that we look at studies on turmeric where Paul might call that, for instance, a toxin to our body. But research shows that that upregulates your body's endogenous, meaning what the body produces, levels of glutathione, the master antioxidant. So if we were really calling it a toxin, yes, there might be some anti-nutrients that stress the body, but just like ketosis can stress the body and yield beneficial outcomes, consumption of something like turmeric, which stresses the body, can still support the body in producing this master antioxidant. And we couldn't say the same thing, for instance, as opposed to like alcohol, right? Alcohol is a known toxin, and there's been no research to show that it actually produces anything in the body favorable. And that's where I sit a little bit differently on the plant matter. Oh, I wanted to also show you real quick before I move forward. Whoop. I have down here a visual. A lot of times when we don't tolerate plant matter, this can be because of leaky gut. So doing a 6-week or even 2-3 month approach to carnivore while you're really getting heavy on the bone broth, the collagen, the gelatin to restore and seal the gut can often help to get through that leaky gut damage. But it might also be because you're in a state of dysbiosis or bacterial overgrowth, or dealing with SIBO, for instance, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And a lot of the vegetables that you were eating may have been FODMAPs, like your cruciferous veg and your avocado and your onions. So we may need to get to the root cause of why you weren't tolerating vegetables. And this may be by doing a gut cleanse. So if you're someone that doesn't tolerate vegetables, but you'd like that diversity and like to explore, you might check out my Beat the Bloat cleanse. And that gives you a protocol of ways to kind of plow the gut so you can push the reset button and your gut bugs can start to work for you. So let's transition from pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory into dysbiosis or bacteria supporting. So dysbiosis driving, y'all know that I am not a proponent of non-caloric sweeteners. The sugar alcohols are going to be digestive distressing because they are going to be greatly absorbed with the small intestine and not metabolized. They are excreted in the urine in the same form. And we know bloating, distension, loose stools, belching can often be seen with consumption of these sweeteners. We know that any of those polyol sugar alcohols can feed small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And stevia, which is not in the sugar alcohol family, but a non-caloric sweetener, has been shown in research to be bacteriostatic, meaning that it sterilizes the good gut bugs. Then there's the chemical additive non-caloric sweeteners like our aspartame and our Splenda, and we've seen neurological concerns as well as tumorigenic activity with the use of some of these chemically adulterated sweeteners. Now, beyond this gut sterility factor and the digestive distress consideration, I always like to discuss this Pavlov's dog effect and how my, success approach with a client is when they say to me, "Oh, Allie, I never knew how sweet an almond could be." And I'm like, yeah, they're totally sweet. You need to really tear the Band-Aid off of your sugar addiction and not replace one abusive boyfriend with another that's just wearing the veil of no calories, no carbs. If you maintain these hyperpalatable sweeteners in your daily regimen, it becomes very difficult to truly redefine your relationship with food. Every time you're at a baby shower or a wedding or your coffee shop, whether you choose to eat it or not, a part of your brain is craving that scone, that muffin, that treat. And it's like this white knuckle battle that you're going on to not consume that food. But if you tear the Band-Aid off and start to channel your palate to be savory, and you start to become very delicately aware of the subtle sweetness in your full fat coconut milk or the subtle sweetness of a seared ribeye, that's when we start to be able to make this a long-term success story, which doesn't have us falling off. Because I can tell you point blank, not trying to say anything special about me, but when I look at a slice of cake, I get a visceral, like goosebump, gross reaction that is not appealing. And I know that in my past life, when I consumed non-caloric sweeteners, cake always looked good to me. So that psychosomatic response is a really important connection to make. And we've seen in research studies that when we get that taste of sweet, we have taste receptors on our tongue called GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide. And this can actually send signals to the brain that we have received glucose, and that does often provoke an insulin response, which is why some people can have hypoglycemic blood sugar drops after having non-caloric sweeteners. So they actually are getting a physiological process. And we do see in research studies that individuals that typically consume the sweet tasting non-caloric foods have interference with metabolic function. So in my book, The Anti-Anxiety Diet Cookbook, I actually have an entire section just focused on why I hate non-caloric sweeteners and my top 5 reasons, a couple of which I left off. So you have to get the book to read the whole breakdown. But I also have a table that might shock you on real food sweeteners that I use in my book that is 80 plus keto-friendly gut healing recipes. And so I use things like raw unfiltered honey or berries or a mashed banana in a recipe of 12 almond flour based muffins. So you're getting 2.5 total grams of carbohydrate per muffin from that contribution, but you're also getting prebiotic fiber. You're also getting potassium. You're also getting B6 pyridoxine, which is a cofactor to activate your serotonin in your brain. So when we go back to these whole foods, we tend to get a myriad of beneficial outcomes. And then we need to determine within our own space and our own metabolism and our own metabolic handicap or level of insulin resistance, what is tolerable. In the beginning, I really recommend tearing off the Band-Aid and doing no sweet. But if you're going to make this a lifestyle, I think that these foods can be incorporated and still keep you well within a ketogenic space. And that's where I go back to this real food over macros, and also that there should not be a yes or no food list for the longevity of this. We all need the myopic tunnel vision of, bananas not keto when we're entering into this. But as we evolve, we have to be mindful with how our body responds metabolically to different foods. So on the other end of the spectrum, beyond the sterility considerations, there are probiotic rich foods, regardless of those natural sweeteners, which honey itself, like I said, is also a prebiotic. And we do see that those berries have tannins that can actually fight bacterial overgrowth in the body. So there's some of those awesome mechanisms from those foods. But then the incorporation of probiotic rich foods is another way to add that abundance in to help our body's optimal function. We see that probiotics can increase butyrate, which is a short chain fatty acid made in our colon based on the presence of good gut bacteria, namely lactobacillus and bifido strains. And butyrate, if we're thinking of ketone bodies, right? BHB, right? So we're talking about beta hydroxybutyrate. There's definitely a connection of optimal butyrate status and successful outcomes in the ketogenic space, and butyrate being supportive of gut integrity and gut health. We also know that probacteria, when balanced in the gut, can enhance our feel-good neurotransmitters. So 90% of the serotonin in our body is manufactured in the gut, as well as the majority of our GABA, and these are our landing gears for our stress response. Probiotics can reduce inflammation. They can enhance our immune function. In fact, one of the only things that can enhance both our innate and our acquired immune system, which is an important consideration during this time of immune risk. So consuming probiotics aids in both the barrier defense of whether our immune system allows a pathogen to become a full-blown infection or doesn't allow it to invade our system in the first place. And then secondarily, if we are infected with a virus or pathogen, a bad bacteria, our acquired immune system functions better in a good gut bacteria status. So this is where we're working with our toll-like receptors of actually teaching our body on an antigen level to upregulate the white blood cell responders to combat and fight. We also know that probiotics can play a role with metabolism. There's a lot of clinical research looking at stool studies of individuals that have an optimal gut microbiome and how their body metabolizes fat as fuel, as well as regulates blood sugar. And we know that the good gut bacteria, when residing in our GI space, actually aid in breaking down the foods that we eat to enhance nutrient absorption, and probiotics actually aid in nutrient production. Biotin and vitamin K are two really important nutrients that are produced in the colon based on our gut microbiome. So foods that you can consider would be like the briny choices of cultured vegetables, whether this is sauerkraut, pickles, kimchi. You want to make sure that you're buying these like local from your farmer's market or at the grocery store in the refrigerated section. If we're buying pickles that have been heat processed, or like your classic sandwich pickles in the grocery store in the middle of the grocery department, then there are no viable cultures there. So important to note, we're not talking about just a vinegar culture, we're talking about that fermentation, that lactofermentation. Kombucha and kefir are both beverages to consider. Kefir would be often considered in the dairy family as like a thick drinkable yogurt, but there also is water kefir and coconut kefir as considerations if you are doing a tight dairy free. And same thing with yogurt. There's fantastic options now. I have a quick coconut yogurt in my cookbook. And if you do tolerate dairy, looking at A2 milk and raw milk would actually be a fantastic support for immune system and gut bacteria health. So if we're looking at this world of carbohydrates, again, it's this consideration of, like in my low carb zucchini collagen muffins, that one banana in the recipe. And again, in my perspective, if you test your blood sugar and it's normalized and you test your ketones and you're producing ketones, then yeah, that's a ketogenic food. There's no such thing as a yes or no list. It's, does my body metabolize and produce ketones when I eat XYZ? And so I find for my body that I function really well in what I deem a phase 1.5 of my protocol of the anti-anxiety diet. I find personally being at a low body fat and a high stressed individual and someone that's running a clinic and writing books and doing all of the things. And yes, I could modify those variables, but those are my selected stressors. that when I go deep, deep, deep into ketosis and my ketones go above 3 in my blood, that I get a little wiry and a little bit squirrely. So that's not my optimal status quo. I find that I'm really good when I'm producing ketones between like a 1.4 to a 2.8 world. And that's the sweet spot that I like to thrive in. I do see that with consideration of this expansion, you may be able to discover new foods, and you might find less disordered eating if you are getting burned out or feeling restrictive. I have a note, if you're stressing out about your celery carbs, then maybe this is something to consider, because it does break from that all or nothing mindset. Anytime we think of cheat or a diet, when we put something on a pedestal, it's demonized and it's thought of as a deviant behavior, and human nature then starts to create often more obsession or craving. So allowing your body to guide your needs is the biggest thing that I'm a huge proponent of. And again, everyone's individual threshold is going to be very different. Everyone's going to feel better in tighter, more restrictive carb control or looser, more liberated carb control in different seasons of their life, different activity factors, and different stress levels. So we need to be mindful of connecting within our own feedback of our body of how we are thriving and how we feel balanced. All right, let's go into the hormone world of things. So we hit inflammation, we hit the microbiome. I want to talk about hormones. So we want to watch foods, eliminating foods that are endocrine or hormone disrupting, and look at foods in consumption that are hormone balancing or regulating. So the big area of endocrine disruptors as far as chemicals and ingredients are found in our pesticides, our preservatives, and our plastics. And maybe some of us listening are familiar with the concept of parabens in like our skincare, looking for paraben-free sunscreen or paraben-free cosmetics, because we've heard about the influence on estrogen dominance and how that paraben can interfere with our thyroid and create cysts in our sexual glands and such. But it might shock some people to know that parabens can be found as preservatives in many foods as well. This is the ingredient list of a Weight Watchers carrot cream cake, which, to be fair, I was pulling ingredients last night when it was really late. And so this is, I think, 19 or 20 grams of carbs. It's not a keto example, but they exist out there, I swear. But obviously, starting with sugar as the first ingredient, it couldn't be that low carb. But just the list of ingredients is really looking more to me like a chemical shitstorm than a food, and looking like something that is made in a laboratory versus growing or grazing and really earning any deservance of coming in my body, to be frank. So when we get down to the middle section here, we can see this potassium sorbate, which is a preservative, and the propylparaben as another preservative. And there are parabens now being used in our food system. These can be found in salad dressings. These can be found in various processed foods. So starting with really looking at your labels, and I would state truly, if you don't understand what the ingredient is, maybe your body will not as well. And that's an easy rule of thumb. Be mindful when I'm saying pesticides. Consider looking at the environmental workers group list of the dirty dozen versus the clean 15, when we're selecting our produce, so we can prioritize financially which selections should be bought as organic. The dirty dozen are the ones that you'd want to invest that intake of organic, because they hold higher amounts of pesticide residue. And then in the plastics, I want to call out that we want to be mindful of that, including packaging, especially heat. So like our coffee pods, if we're doing like Keurig things, anything that is a heated plastic is going to leach endocrine disrupting compounds, which distress our hormones. And then within our own body fat, as I mentioned before, the individual that had lost significant amount of body fat in 2 to 3 months, liver enzymes, which are supposed to be under 35, were upwards in the 400s. I think that maybe one of her panels was 792, if I'm remembering correctly. So remarkably elevated values we can see from fat liberation. So we do need to be mindful of this. And this is why I'm a huge proponent of proactively supporting detoxification with dynamic body fat loss. Because otherwise what we can see is, although we didn't lose that lean mass, although the keto kept the lean mass on, and so that maintained our basal metabolic rate, we can see those endocrine disruptors maybe not driving estrogen dominance, but maybe driving hypothyroid and shutting down our thyroid function, maybe interfering with our blood sugar metabolism and driving severe insulin resistance, even though we're not eating the high carbohydrate based foods. So we have to be mindful of the hormone that's liberated with body fat loss. So to balance our hormones, I recommend being proactive with these sulfur-containing compounds. This is the world of our cruciferous vegetables. So we're talking about like indole-3 carbanols in our broccoli and our cabbage, and you're gonna get a 2-for-1 if that vegetable's fermented, like sauerkraut, where you're getting the probacteria with the cruciferous vegetable. We're looking at binding fibers. Chia seed is a fantastic tool. And these are things to be more proactive with when you're liberating high amounts of body fat loss. So if you just lost 20 pounds, I would recommend doing a deep dive of at least like a 10-day reset of an abundance of these detox supporting foods, and then go on to your next 20 pounds. We have to pause and give our body the biochemical nutrients it requires to do the work, to not get burdened and then deal with falling off or getting frustrated and not getting the results we're looking to achieve. So this is where flaxseed and hemp seed can also be used to help to support hormone regulation. Hemp seed is very rich in GLA, gamma-linoleic acid. This is a very helpful hormone for all ages, but especially perimenopausal and menopausal women. The flaxseed actually aids in metabolism of our estrogen and can increase our estriol or our E3, which can balance out our estradiol or estrogen dominance in the body. We need to consider when we're looking at detox that there's 2 phases of detoxification. There is hydroxylation, or the process in the liver that takes that fat soluble toxin and makes it water soluble. This is actually what can create more havoc, because if your liver is hydroxylating or activating toxins, but you're not getting that phase 2 of encapsulation and excretion, which requires sulfur containing compounds, then we can actually have more intermediary chemical reactions where we get more inflammatory distress from that liberated toxin from the body fat loss that's been now activated when it was dormant and sleeping. Now it's awake and activated, and we need to ensure we're getting the nutrients to encapsulate and remove. If this is of interest to you, or you've hit a roadblock before, you can check out my 10-day detox. I have an ebook which you can start with, and it's a really great read on the biochemical processes of detox and food as medicine support. So how you keto matters. Again, considering both that removal of, right, those 3 categories of foods, and maybe exploring the abundance of some of those areas of foods. We want to consider our own unique priorities. You know, a 55-year-old man and a 23-year-old woman are going to have very different priorities of health, even if they're both looking for weight loss. There's other mechanisms involved in that complex chemistry equation. We want to always try to limit the pro-inflammatory foods, and that means trying to look at choices that are free of toxins, additives, and preservatives. We want to limit or reduce our use of these non-caloric sweeteners and start to channel that savory flavor profile. We want to seek a diet that's high in antioxidants and variety of color and seasonal local produce. And again, I'm absolutely on board with pulsing in and out of carnivore, but I do feel if we're really looking at mimicking ancestral patterns, that we do need to be mindful so that our environmental toxins are significantly higher today than they were in ancestral times. We would need to consider, for that reason, the use of sulfur in the diet, like broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, and I do recommend cooking them or eating them in a sprout form so that we get less of the goitrogenic impact on the thyroid. We would ideally be incorporating both probiotic and prebiotic fibers to feed and maintain the beneficial flora in our gut. And we want to ensure that the animal products that we are selecting are quality sourced. And when we're consuming animal product, we are consuming snout to tail. So we are getting in organs, which are the most nutrient dense food available to us, rich in CoQ10 and hundreds of times more rich in B vitamins than any other food. We want to ensure we're consuming the skin on our proteins, like bone-in, skin-on chicken thighs, because we're getting more of that glycine, or pork rinds from quality source. And of course, as I mentioned, the bone broth for connective tissue and gut health. The wild card to all of this that's really important to bring up with today's climate, and why I'm happy to have the resources available to you of my anti-anxiety diet and anti-anxiety diet cookbook, is that even if we're mastering a perfect approach and we're hitting all of those check boxes on the chart, that cortisol and stress can be the wild card of our successful outcomes. So cortisol has a sweet spot in the body. Too much is going to drive belly fat gain, anxiety, insomnia, restlessness, and irritation, and kind of like an Incredible Hulk mode of bitey short fuse. And too little can leave us apathetic and flatlined, dealing with chronic inflammation and low energy and brain fog. And when we have too low of cortisol, we can often see that bloating in the belly as well. It may not be microbiome, it could be the adrenal insufficiency. You may know a family member, you may personally have used a prednisone pack or a corticosteroid to be an anti-inflammatory tool if you've had upper respiratory stress or an inflammatory flare in your body. And so we know that there's a sweet spot. We don't want to lower it to nothing, and we don't want it so high that it's interfering with our mood, sleep, and body fat metabolism. It's important to note that even if you're doing, again, a perfect diet, that your body can release cortisol based on mentally emotional stress. And so no longer are we running from that saber-toothed tiger during a stressful time. We might be stressed of our environment with the pandemic going on. We might be stressed with our interpersonal relationships. We might be stressed about finances. And even if you're fasting, consuming nothing, or even if you're eating, again, the perfect Ali Miller approved food as medicine keto diet, when we're under stress, that cortisol hormone is a glucocorticoid, and that is a sugar producing compound in our body. So this drives blood sugar production, which is going to elevate our blood sugar. And if we're not using that blood sugar, like fighting and fleeing, and we're staying home and we're less active, then that reduces our utilization of that glucose that came from that stress hormone, and that further can perpetuate insulin resistance as well as blood sugar cravings, because we can get a drop from the blood sugar just as quickly as we had that spike. So in my books that I have available for y'all, I have a 6R approach of how I employ the anti-anxiety diet. And it does dig into some of the concepts that we discussed. So I first focus on removing inflammation, because if the brain is in an inflammatory state, that creates like a white noise, and we're not getting optimal signaling with our neurotransmitters. Within my inflammatory foods, one of them I demonize right off the bat is sugar. And that's where I introduce right away the power of the ketogenic diet. I look at resetting the microbiome, and when the gut is in a balanced state, it makes more of the feel-good neurotransmitters. If it's in a dysbiotic, imbalanced state, it makes more adrenaline and keeps us keyed up for that stress response. The gut's literally telling the brain, ish ain't right? So we're constantly feeling at unease. We look to repair the gut lining. So now that we've removed inflammation and we've reset the microbiome, we want to seal the tank for healthy gut integrity, for better nutrient absorption. We want to restore our micronutrients that play a role in our brain-body feedback. So I discover with y'all mood stabilizing minerals and brain balancing B vitamins and the specific amino acids that actually build our neurotransmitters. I go into a deep dive on how to rebound your adrenals, and I unpack that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA fight or flight axis. And then I finally teach you all about how to rebalance your neurotransmitters. Each of the chapters in the book has quizzes so that you can associate which area you need to dig deeper into and spend more of a functional approach as opposed to just a wide foundational delivery. And then the anti-anxiety diet cookbook I brought in last year to be a little bit of a gentle introduction. So the anti-anxiety diet is high-powered hose, you know, go, deep level science, a nonfiction read that has recipes. But the anti-anxiety diet cookbook might be a more gentle introduction, which still gives you the ideas associated with these 6R approaches, and that has 80 recipes and beautiful photographs done by my podcast co-host, Becky Yu. So I truly believe that food is a double-edged sword, and foods can provide nourishment as building blocks for our brain, as optimizers for our mood and our metabolic function, as well as food can cause destruction in the brain and whole body health. So if you'd like to explore either of those resources, I highly recommend that you do. You can find everything else from me over at AllieMillerRD.com. And I'm at Allie Miller RD on social media if you'd like to follow along on Instagram or any of the spaces. And I have programs as well. I have a virtual keto program, my 10-day detox, my Beat the Bloat cleanse if we're talking about dysbiosis, and adrenal rehab, a great one to consider now when we're all mitigating the blue light and the chronic stress that many of us are finding ourselves under. And I have free resources, including protocols and a quiz on supplements. If you go to the homepage, you'll see this pink button, and that'll give you an entry point of some functional formulas you may want to discover further. And the last resource I have for you that's also free is the Naturally Nourished podcast, which is available on all avenues where podcasts play. We will be at over 200 episodes when you're watching this. So you can literally Google Allie Miller podcast and a topic and see what comes up. But we have anything from PCOS to insomnia to is dairy good for me, and so much more in between. I hope that you will enjoy exploring food as medicine and that this lecture has given you some food for thought.